All right. So Cindy mentioned this is part 3 of a 3-part series. The other 2 parts are available online, so you can watch them whenever you want if you're just coming in on this 3rd session. So some of the other actions that take place once a submission is done are different types of error checking. So we use a submission system called CAIUS to push into grants.gov the applications that are going to be submitted to NIH through grants.gov. And this gives us like an extra layer of electronic checking that's done before the proposal even goes into grants.gov. Then grants.gov does some error checking, and NIH does error checking. And in both grants.gov and NIH, the error checking that they do may occur in stages. And so what that means is if they find an error that may stop the rest of the checks that are being done, and they'll send a message back and say, you've got an error, let's say, for example, in a PI's profile that is going to prevent the package from being able to be processed. And so we might correct that error and do a corrected submission just to find out that later on in the processing stages, there's another error that comes up that stops things again. And so that's something that's good to know, because that kind of plays into why we tell you to try and submit early. It's because some of the error checkings don't happen immediately when we hit the buttons to submit, and when they cross the servers into grants.gov or NIH, they happen later on down the line. Some of them even happen after the NIH validation window, which if you've done NIH submissions, you're aware of that. The validation window is when the proposal is submitted and it's processed through grants.gov and NIH. NIH will post it in ERA Commons so that you can see how the transmittal looks. So if you have a picture or a diagram that maybe shifts positions for some reason, or something that looks blurry, it gives you an opportunity to be able to go in and replace that submission and try and correct that issue. That validation window is only there for 2 days though, and that 2-day window truncates at the deadline. So if you submit on the deadline date, say at 2 o'clock, then you only really have 3 hours of that validation window. To take full advantage of the validation window, you have to submit 2 days before the deadline. After it goes through the validation window, then it goes into the Center for Scientific Review, and there'll be another series of electronic checks that are run on it then. And they'll also do some manual checking to see if certain required files are there, or certain parts of files, especially if the solicitation specifically required like a special section in your research strategy or something like that. It's also possible that besides the manual checks that the gatekeepers will do as it goes into CSR, that your program officer may also do a manual check to see if certain things are available in the package that need to be there for review. So if you find something that needs to be corrected and you need to do an update or a correction to your file, one of the things that you can do is called a change or corrected file. And these can be initiated by the PI. They can be requested by the PI or by ORS, and ORS has to be the one to do the submission on them. Prior to the deadline, you can automatically process a change or correction without needing any clearance or approvals from the program officer. After the deadline, sometimes we will recommend that you talk to the program officer to see if they think that you should do the change or correction or not, because many times after the deadline, your proposal would be considered a late submission, and they won't consider it. You'll be eliminated from review depending on the reason why you're doing the correction. Sometimes there are considerate if you're having some type of a server issue or something like that. But if you forgot a file or you loaded the wrong file, they usually aren't considerate of that. And so your late submission would result in a denial for going forward. Another action that can be done is a withdrawal. This could be where the PI is asking that it be withdrawn, ORS is deciding that it needs to be withdrawn, or the program officer or the science officer may ask that the proposal be withdrawn. And there's a variety of reasons why this could happen. From the PI side, maybe there's been a medical issue or something come up where the PI can't do the work anymore. Or maybe something has happened similarly with your team. A big component of a subcontract is going to have to be changed for some reason. ORS might ask for it to be withdrawn because something was submitted that was incorrect. For example, maybe if cost share or something was promised that hadn't been coordinated and couldn't be approved after the fact, that would be something that we might request withdrawal on. The program officer and the science officer, the main reason that I've seen them come back and ask for a withdrawal is because they know that there is a funding action that's in progress for one of the involved PIs or co-PIs that is going to affect whether or not they want to review this new submission that's going in. You can also have supplementary funding that might be involved after a proposal has gone in. Administrative supplementary funding can be done for things like if you have a piece of equipment that breaks and you need to get that replaced in order to continue the work. Or there's been some team change, like a major PI dropped out and you need to find a replacement and that person's going to cost a little bit more. So you need some supplementary funding to include that. So just a variety of things are possible for a supplementary funding request. Another type of funding is diversity funding or a diversity supplement. And what that is you already have an award and you have a student or a postdoc that's come to your attention that is in a diverse population that you think would benefit from being able to work on this award with you, but they weren't included in the original funding. So you can ask for a diversity supplement to cover this student or postdoc being able to participate in the award action. Other types of supplementary funding include requests for travel or conferences and things like that. You might have a request for information come from your program officer or science officer. Those will usually happen soon after submission or at the point that your proposal is being considered for going to a review panel. And sometimes they come while the review panel is meeting. If they have a question that they would like answered while the review panel is in session. You have to pay really close attention to these emails because sometimes they're not really a request for information. They are a request for no contact. So on certain, in certain divisions and review panels, they want to ensure that there is no contact going on between the PI and the PI's organization and the review panel or the science officers. And so they'll send out an email asking you not to contact until they tell you that it's okay to send something in, because they don't want there to be any question that you tried to influence the review panel. When your proposal is processed into NIH and is assigned to a review panel, it'll have an application identification number assigned to it. Many times when you're talking with the program officer or you're filling out forms, like if you're doing a resubmission, they won't ask for this whole number. They'll ask for just the center part of that number, the A1183723 in our example here. So this just gives you some information about how they break down that number and what it means, in case you've never seen that before. So when we're talking about the life cycle of the grant, and as it's going into NIH, It goes from you working on it and your research team to ORS, and ORS does the final submission into grants.gov and NIH. Once it's received and starts to be processed there, it goes into the Center for Scientific Review. And that's where its official tracking number is assigned and where they decide what study section it's going to be assigned to. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit when we talk about the reviews and how things handle as far as the funding announcements. I just wanted to kind of give you an overview right now. So when you're looking for grant-related information and the review information for NIH, these are some of the sites that you can go to obtain information. The Open Mic blog is one that I wanted to mention. This has information not only related to just general grants and review type of information, but it also has announcements on things coming down the pike and announcements that certain notices have been issued. So if you don't get the Open Mic blog and you intend to do a lot of NIH related work, you might want to consider signing up for that. As your proposal goes into the review cycle, most of the actions that take place are going to be centered around your program officer and the Center for Scientific Review. So there's a lot of information here that you can find out, like descriptions of the study sections. If you're not sure what one you should ask for when you're doing your submission, there's a tool that you can use where they'll help give you some advice. It also gives you when they intend on having review panel meetings, and you can find a lot of other different information there too. So I mentioned before, the Center for Scientific Review is the one that assigns the study section. They control the whole process related to the peer review that's done on the proposals that are being submitted. And this is outside of any reviews that your program officer or your science officer might do on the proposal. And for the most part, your program officer is not involved in a lot of the review stuff. They might look to make sure that you have everything there, and they might help facilitate you contacting the science officer to see if you can change some information prior to a study section meeting. But they're not heavily involved in any comments or anything like that. The science officer is more involved, and they kind of help control the review process. They don't usually vote on the meeting when the study section is meeting, but they help facilitate and manage the review that's going on. For the reviewers for NIH, they usually have standing review committees that are always available to be assigned for when the Center for Scientific Review wants to put together a panel of reviewers to go over a certain grouping of submissions that have come in. So the standing review committee is usually appointed for 4 to 6 years. And if you look, you can find most of the people that are on these review committees. So you have some idea of the people that are going to be reviewing your submission. 30 days before review, the members of the review committee are usually posted for those particular study sections. And you can go in and look and see if you think that those members have the expertise to actually evaluate your proposal, or if you think that maybe your proposal needs to go to a different area. The initial look that is done at your submission may result in something called streamlining. And so streamlining is where your proposal is not going to be reviewed, essentially. It's not going to be discussed because something happened that they considered it non-competitive. It either didn't meet what the solicitation was asking for in their opinion, or there was something non-compliant in the submission that was made that has made it where they don't want to consider it for review. Another thing that can be decided is you're not given an impact score, so they know that you're not going to be funded and they're not looking at you for funding. But they are going to give you some summary of the review that happened. although you might not get a full review or a whole resume of the discussion that took place. And they do this sometimes, especially for new investigators, to kind of give them some pointers on areas that they need to improve in their submission. The other type of review that they do is a scored review. And when you get a scored review, you may or may not be considered for funding. So just because you see a status change in ERA Commons that you're being scored doesn't mean that you're being considered for funding. When you have a scoring type of review done, you might receive the score and the review discussion comments both. You'll usually always receive the score and some comments, but how detailed a comment you get may depend on the type of committee that met and your program officer. If you don't get the level of comments back that you think you should have and you did receive scores, you're always welcome to contact your program officer to see if they can provide more information to you. You also have the option, and I believe I mentioned this later on in the slides, to ask your program officer to sit in on the review that takes place on your proposal. They are allowed to go to the study section and sit during the review and see what is discussed and to come back and give you some information about that. But they're not allowed to participate in any manner, so they can't ask questions or anything like that. So after your study section meets, then all the applications that were reviewed by that section with their scores go to what's called the advisory council. And the advisory council has your program officer sitting on it. And we'll talk a little bit more about these scores later. So the overall scores that you're given are 1 to 9, with 1 being the best, and 1 to 3 is the highest bracket in the area. If you have a 1 to 3, you stand a higher chance of being funded. When you have been notified that your proposal has gone to the advisory council, then you can direct questions to the program officer, and you wouldn't talk to the science officer at that point because they've handed things back to the program officer. In ERA Commons is where you'll find the scores posted. Usually those happen within 3 days of the review committee closing everything out. That doesn't mean that your summary statement of the comments are available. Usually those take 4 to 8 weeks to process and be posted. There are status codes that you can look at on this link that'll give you more information when you're looking at ERA Commons and you're determining what the status, like, is your proposal in review? Has it been sent to a study committee yet? Where is it at? I'm going to go more into the funding information, like how long does it take once you have a review to when you get the funding. But normally from the time you put your proposal in until you get notified that you might be funded, that's usually at 9 to 12 months. If you receive contact back from NIH on anything related to your submitted proposal, then you should contact somebody in ORS as soon as possible. So if there's things that we need to do, we can be starting to take those actions in our office. So for example, you could be contacted for more information, and many times if that's not submitted in email, it either has to be submitted through our office or even the email has to come from someone who has signature authority for the university. You might be contacted for what's called just in time, which means you're being considered for funding and they want some updated information for you. And if you didn't submit a detailed budget to begin with, they may ask for a detailed budget at that time. Many times the contacts that come in from NIH, especially if it's from the time you submit it until an initial award announcement comes in, they are usually wanting responses within 3 days to a week and a half. So you have to be very careful to look at the emails to see when the deadline for you to respond is. So here's a snapshot of ERA Commons because I wanted to show you what the screens look like. And if you look, it gives you information on the far left related to who your contacts are for the scientific review, who your administrative contact is for the grants, and who your program officer is. They try to keep this pretty up to date. So if you've heard that your program officer changed, you should be able to go here and see who the new person is. And many times if you don't see, like if it's blank or you see the old person's name still listed, if you contact the grant management specialist, they'll help provide that information for you and can notify ERA Commons that it needs to be added. You'll see down here where it talks in the bottom middle, where it shows you the number that was assigned to it, the study section that was assigned, when the meeting was held, how long it was held. You can look at the roster of who was there in the meeting. You can see the scores that it got and what percentile that it came in. If you were early stage or new investigator eligible and it shows as a no on this screen, then that's something that you want to contact NIH to get corrected, because if you've loaded that information in your profile correctly, then it should be showing. And this can have an impact on funding, because usually there are set aside funds for early stage investigators and new investigators that would increase your chances for funding if those are indicated in your profile, where you'll be considered for those. So when we talk about scoring at NIH, and they talk about the 9 scores that are given, these are how they structure the 9 scores. So this first bracket that's called high, these are the ones that are going to be funded. Not necessarily if you get a 2 or 3, most commonly if you get a 1. There are some 2s and 3s funded though, and that will depend on how much budget there is available for that particular division or solicitation to provide funding, and sometimes on whether or not you're a new investigator or not, or if you're applying for something where there has been special set aside funds, like a notice of special interest has been sent that you're applying to. So for your particular proposal, you'll also get information related to your overall score and the score from the team that is meeting, your review panel team. And one of the things that I want to point out that is confusing is that your overall score is based on 1 to 5, where 1 is outstanding, but the evaluation score that you get from the review panel is flipped. It's 1 to 7, with 7 being excellent. So a higher score, the higher scores that you get on the evaluation criteria are good. And it's just the opposite if you're looking at the overall score on where you rank with everyone and what your funding chances are. So here, this is what one looked like for that wasn't picked for funding. And here's one that was picked for funding. So you can see if you compare between the two, numbers wise for the overall score, they weren't that far apart. This one was 1.63 and this one was 2.65. So they weren't that far apart. But when you look down at the criteria scores, this one ranged from 5 to 6 and this one ranged from 5 to 6. So it's sometimes hard to read the differences between these, and they will also provide you more information. If you get the summary of report, it'll go through each of these different criteria and it'll tell you more information about what the reviewers felt about those certain areas and why they gave you the score that they gave you. So we talked before about how the flow kind of goes to the point that it gets to the study section. This is more focused on the timing. So from the time you submit your proposal until it gets to goes through all the validation and error checks and it gets assigned to the study section and the actual peer review takes place, usually takes 3 to 4 months. And we've had quite a few in the last year that are actually taking 6 months because of the slowdowns related to COVID. So after the peer review takes place, then it takes another 1 to 2 months for the council review to take place. And so the council review is when the ratings and everything go back to the institute that's going to provide the funding, and they look at how the particular submissions are relevant to the programs that are providing the funding. The program officer kind of helps massage it through this process. It goes to the advisory council and at that institute, and the advisory council looks at them and ranks them on which ones they think should be funded. Sometimes the program officer can have a deciding role in the, like if there's a tie on the advisory council, they may help decide that tie, or they may send it on to the institution director. The final decision on what is going to be funded is made by the director of each particular institution. And they can do that on their own based on the advisory council's recommendations, or they may do that in concert with a panel of people that they pull together above the advisory council. Then those final decisions are sent back to the program officer. The program officer will find out if there's any updated information that's needed. And then it'll be sent to the grants management person at NIH, who will start working on double checking all the financial related information, putting the award package together to send to the institution, and the negotiations with the institution on accepting the award. So it usually takes about 9 months from the time it goes in submitted until an actual notice and award announcement may go out to the institution. And I've mentioned before, we've seen some of those go to 12 months too. We've actually had a couple that came up way after that. So when you're talking to NIH staff, it's helpful to know who you need to contact when. So you can talk to the program officer pretty much at any time, but especially before you submit the application, when you're trying to figure out your study section, you're trying to decide if what you want to research fits within the priorities that a particular division wants to look at. And maybe you just need some advice on the research that you're doing to see if you're in the right spot or considering the right solicitation. So these are things that they would help you with. A science officer can also help you with some of these things, or if you have done the submission and are having some questions about a review panel that you've been assigned to, or possibly that you might need to get it changed, then your science officer is also the person that you want to talk to. The science officer is usually the person who asks you for additional or corrected materials, either as part of prior to a review panel, or sometimes for just-in-time documents. And sometimes just-in-time documents can also be requested from your program officer. After peer review has happened and you have questions about your summary statement or how to respond to some of the critiques that were made, or maybe you want to talk to someone and find out, well, it didn't get picked this time, is it worthwhile for me to resubmit? Then your program officer can help give you some of that information and advice. At any point in the process, if you have questions about administrative issues related to the budget, or related to an award budget, or policies that NIH has on award management or grants in general, you can always contact the grant specialist. We would recommend, though, that anytime you contact the grant specialist, to contact ORS first, because a lot of times we know some of those answers, and that can save you some time waiting for a response back from the grant specialist. So your program officer actually works for the institute that you are putting the submission into. And I mentioned before, you can talk to them before submission and after review. And you can send them a draft of your specific aims or your summary and ask them to tell you what they think about it, how relevant they feel that you are being to the solicitation that you're thinking about submitting to. You can ask them if they would give you some comments on the impact of your research. And you can ask them if they have recommendations for who you should put as the study section. It's not uncommon that we've had program officers who received like a one-page abstract from the PIs here and have told them that, oh, you're in the wrong area. You need to talk to this program officer, and they'll even sometimes send your white paper to the new person and like introduce you to them and say, we think this falls in your area and here's the PI and stuff to help open that door for you. In many respects, the program officer works for you, but they have hundreds of people that they're trying to support. So don't expect that they're going to be able to call and talk to you for 3 or 4 hours or something like that. And it's always better if you preface a call to them by sending them some type of an email first with a heads up of what you want to talk about, or to see if you can schedule a time to talk with them. And I mentioned before, once you have your study section, you can ask your program officer to sit in on the review panel for you. When you contact your science officer, it's not necessarily, but if you're having trouble figuring out your study section, they are also a contact that can give you information about that. Normally, your science officer works for the Center for Scientific Review. So they don't work in the institution that's providing the funding. They work in the area that's doing the review of the quality of the package that you're submitting. I mentioned before, your science officer is non-voting on your review panel, but they kind of facilitate and manage the whole process. They may be listed in the funding opportunity announcement, or you may have to wait to hear who it is based on the assignment to the review section that you're going to be on. Because a lot of times when they post that information in ERA Commons on your assignment to the review panel, they'll also post who your science officer is. Sometimes they'll post the science officer early, so you just have to be watching in ERA Commons to see. And there's also a lot of times the program officer will know who the science officer is going to be. Once it gets assigned in ERA Commons, then you can contact them freely once they're listed, unless they send you an email and ask you not to contact. This link here at the bottom has more information about talking to the NIH staff and what types of questions are common for people to ask. So some of my special notes and takeaway: we recommend that you establish a relationship with your program officer, reach out to them. Don't ask them questions that you can find by reading the guidelines. Volunteer to be a reviewer, because this is an excellent way to find out the types of papers that are being submitted in your career field, but it also helps establish a relationship with your program officer because you're helping them by volunteering to be a reviewer. Do not think that because you might be new in the field that you wouldn't be selected to be a reviewer, because they do look for young people or newer people to these research areas, because you might have new ideas and it gives you exposure, and they're aware of that. That can help you in your career. They also sometimes look for people on these review panels who don't have experience, like they're coming from the public or from other areas, and so they don't have experience in your particular field to give them an idea of how readable and how understandable the packages are that are being submitted. If you don't have your ERA Commons registration, we recommend that you go ahead and take care of that. If you've got any team members that are going to be going on the proposal with you, then you need to make sure that they have their ERA Commons registration done. And if they're from outside of OU Norman, those registrations have to be done through their organization. And I wanted to give you a heads up that NIH has already announced that effective in January the 25th, 2022, everyone who is listed on your senior key persons form must have an ERA Commons registration. So if you list a collaborator or a consultant or an advisor as a key person, they must have an ERA Commons registration number to go on their form. Make sure that your profile with your ERA Commons registration is correct and current, especially for the proposals that you're submitting. If you're an early stage or new investigator, you must have it flagged on your profile. If you don't have it flagged here, then you won't be considered for early stage investigator or new investigator funding, because this is where they pull where you're able to participate in this funding or not. Your profile has to match the role that you have on the proposal. And we've had a couple of issues with this in the past. So for example, if you have somebody at a company who's going to be a PI with you on the proposal, make sure that they double check, because we had a case where a PI at a company was actually listed as a senior science officer, and that caused an error after the validation window had closed, because it was something that wasn't checked into a later stage of error checking. It's caused an error that caused the whole proposal not to be able to be reviewed. If you don't have your ORCID registration, go ahead and do that. If you haven't started using Science CV, then you need to start your registrations and start using that. NIH has announced like a year and a half ago that they were going to become 100% ORCID registration compliant for all PIs and co-PIs doing business with the NIH at some point in the future. They've started including this in the solicitations that are coming out. So for example, all of the K-series applications now, if you are listed as a PI, you must have ORCID registration included with that submission. And what NIH has said is that as different series of solicitations are coming out, so for example, R21s, R01s, they're going to start including this requirement with them until they get it in all the solicitations that are coming out. Science CV, they've announced that as of some point in fiscal year 22, they are going to start using Science CV as the primary source for you to generate certain information like current and pending and possibly biosketches. So we highly recommend that if you haven't done those two, that you get started on them. Become familiar with information that's available on the NIH website, and I have a link here. There have been some recent changes for requirements for biosketches and other support. We are offering special training for those, which recordings are available on the training website. The one thing you want to make sure is that if you're doing a submission, either of a proposal or of an RPRR report, that you're using the most current forms, which are dated 2023 in the upper right. And that you, if you're not going to look at that training, go online and look at the information that's posted with those two sections at NIH. There are changes that become mandatory in January that both OU Norman and OU HSC have already made a requirement for any proposals going in effective July the 1st, 2021. Make sure when you're writing your proposal that you're using and reading the general guidelines and the specific announcement that you're submitting to, because you need to use both of those documents to be able to have the files that they want to see in the submission. If you have any questions or you need help related to anything, you can contact risk@ou.edu, and if they can't answer your question, they'll find the person who can. If you know you're going to submit a proposal, then go ahead and submit the info sheet, and the person who will help you over here will contact you, and they can answer general questions or specific questions related to the proposal that you want to submit. We work very closely with the Center for Faculty Excellence. I wanted to point out that they are providing training on Science CD and also ORCID. So if that's something that you need help with, then contact CFE. If you have questions that are related to post-award activities, those no longer fall under the Office of Research Services. They fall under Research Financial Services now, and this is a contact where you can reach them. And that